this session, we would be talking about issues that organizations like CBGA and other such organizations which are locating themselves in the landscape of governance, those kinds of issues that we should be talking about, which we think are going to be more important in the next decade. And for this discussion, we have Professor Praveen Jha. Professor Jha is very well known to all of you. He teaches economics in the Center for Economic Studies and Planning in JNU, but he is somebody who has mentored the team in CBGA.
Thanks a lot to all of you for being here. Public discourses on governance, where do we go from here? So that's the theme, the way the architecture of democracy tends to get hijacked by powers that be, the changes in structure of power globally, nationally, etc. These are some of the very powerful concerns which CBGA or any organization interested in progressive transformation has to contend with. So that's one set of issues, and we'll hopefully hear more about these. Second, something which is again foundational to discourses in social science. Of course, political science is the key discipline where these have been discussed at some length. The distinction, for instance, between the substantive and the procedural. When we talk of governance, when we talk of any management of any society, the question of rights, the question of what a society is entitled to, and so on and so forth. So, with respect to all these, this is something which is an extremely important distinction, and my fear is that with neoliberalism, with its ascendancy, the substantive got kicked out of the room. The entire focus of much of the discourses on governance in the last 30-odd years, 40-odd years, has been with the procedural. And that's a huge problem. In fact, in very fundamental ways, it's a retrogression. Some of the things which we had taken for granted, for instance, we can go back to at least the Karachi Adhiveshan of Congress in 1931, subsequently a series of other very important social compacts that the political leadership, the political process, the mobilization which had happened under the banner of Indian National Congress had resulted in a number of very, very important social compacts, finally culminating in our constitution. Now, a number of extremely important substantive ideas which we had committed to. For instance, 1931 Karachi session, we can easily recall ideas like why we must have free universal health care, free universal education, and likewise a number of very important ideas which were enshrined, and it seemed as if there was unanimity on all this. The resource question was discussed, and it was said, no, it's not an issue. We can always find resources for these very critical concerns. These have to be the starting point, and so on. We had made, in terms of our social compact, that is, the compact between those who commanded the reins of the nation at that point in time, the political class, the administrative class, the citizens at large. Right? They gave us, and we gave us ourselves, a fantastic constitution in spite of all its warts and problems which remain. Yeah? But most of these, we are close to some 65 years from the date of the Constitution, and almost 70 years from the date of independence from the colonial rule. Where are we going? Where are we headed? Why is it that many of these are not only sort of anywhere close to being achieved, but in very fundamental ways are receding further? When we get into the questions of quality, etc., we know that there's a sort of story which we witness. Even up to 1980s or so, the way many of the juridical interventions happened, So this is the first major issue which I wanted to flag, that there is something about the substantive issues relating to our public discourses on governance, which seem to have taken a back seat, which is a massive disservice to the social compact that over a period of time we had built, we had more or less internalized in terms of thinking about our constitution, other processes, etc. But it seems as if, we are reneging on many of that. And that is a worrisome thing. So where do we go from here? To me, it's very clear the first objective should be to reclaim those substantive ideas, those substantive dimensions of our founding vision, etc., instead of just remaining trapped in the procedural issues. And I'll come to some of those procedural issues in a moment. We can talk about a couple of major, let's say, concerns which have been floating around in the last decade, couple of decades and so on. Lots of discussions on these, how certain kinds of procedural interventions and innovations are supposed to be kind of the magic bullet, the panacea to solve the core problems, etc. And in that basket, one thing which probably would be very close to the top is this whole debate between whether there should be kind provisioning or cash transfers. As you know, that there has been a growing emphasis on sort of the importance of cash transfers, and the official position seems more and more inclined towards doing away with whatever infrastructure and architecture of kind provisioning we have had in several areas, and saying, no, let's just get out of that. Standard arguments supporting cash transfers, and cash transfers not only for one or two activities, but in almost an umbrella sense is what gets advocated by the official spokespersons. So the argument is that this is something which is hugely inefficient. There are lots of leakages, corruption, and so on and so forth. There are high administrative costs. Apart from administrative incompetencies, along with that, the argument is this can lead to and has led to all kinds of iniquities, etc. I'm sure most of you are familiar with these debates, so let me not labor on many of these points which have been raised, but simply ask whether there is decent merit if we start taking this argument and this kind of advocacy in a lock, stock, and barrel sense. Yeah. Now, it seems to me that what we are witnessing in terms of this very aggressive advocacy for cash transfers is fundamentally the desire on the part of the regimes in last 25 years or so to abdicate their responsibility in a number of key areas. Right? Now, of course, cash transfers for certain kinds of things, is most natural and most obvious. But when it comes to a number of merit goods, there are, again, these are ideas which are a bit contested, public goods, merit goods, how do we define these in a precise manner, etc. But in general, let's say there is a reasonable understanding that yes, these are very important constituent elements of our public and social infrastructure, right? Health, education, and a whole range of other things. A number of services which are described as essential services. So when it comes to these, does it make sense at all if we start thinking through the kind of reality that we constitute as a society and as a nation? Is there any sense in pushing for sort of this blanket support for cash transfers? For instance, much of it was discussed in the context of PDS, that let's do away with this massively corrupt Gargantum kind of architecture of provisioning food, and just give them money. You have a number of very well-meaning, within quotes, progressive thinkers and scholars who have been talking about it. Now, if you go to any vulnerable area in this country where food vulnerability is a huge issue. Now, instead of trying to do something about that infrastructure, instead of ensuring, as in the case of education, health infrastructure, I'm sure Ravi will talk about it maybe tomorrow, day after, whenever, right? He has been working on these issues for donkey's years now. Why don't we see these absolutely basic prerequisites which need to be there before we start pushing for things like cash transfer, right? So a whole range of very fundamental structural constraints and prerequisites, are they there? And this refers to an entire range of essential services that we are talking about. With reference to each one of these, the ground reality is extremely disturbing, right? If that be the case, then what else could be the conclusion except saying that the government simply wants to abdicate, right? It simply doesn't want to make sure that what we had agreed in terms of very fundamental entitlements, okay, we just want to let these go. I mean, with respect to education, for instance, even today, OECD countries, which are obviously economically and in many other ways, in terms of overall well-being, the leaders of the pack, if you look at them, in OECD countries, more than 90% of schools are government schools, right? School education is fundamentally a commitment of public provisioning, right? Now, apart from ensuring a decent infrastructure for these basic services, of course, there is that associated concern when it is through public provisioning of shared citizenship and quality concerns, right? We often, our leadership is often quite enamored by the most powerful country in the world and wants to ape it, and there is this whole impression that it's driven completely by market in almost every sphere and so on. The USA, right? Now, education there, for instance, I'm sure many of you are aware of it. Basically, it's a system of neighborhood schools, right? Of course, the quality and economic heft of neighborhoods certainly differ. But then, at least at that level, you have something which is common for all children belonging to that particular neighborhood. We know that good quality, decent educational infrastructure facilitates negotiation of the sense of citizenship right since early days. It does facilitate and help everybody in that class, in that school, to come to terms with differences across caste, gender, a whole lot of other social and political considerations and so on, right? Now, these are absolutely fundamental concerns. Yeah. Now, do we want to just give up on these? And to me, I mean, I have no doubt whatsoever that when it comes to all these essential services, the question of quality for overwhelming majority will go for a 6, is going for a 6, yeah, is something which is not being taken seriously at all. Right? So, it is very important for, I think, all of us to raise our voice against these simple-minded fixes. So, for a variety of structural and social inequities, it's very clear that core public goods, basic services, essential services, etc., cannot and must not be left in the domain of cash transfers. What are the challenges to the extent that you want to do anything, whether using one package of instruments or some other package of instruments, whether it's cash transfer or whatever else, and so on and so forth? If you look at the challenges, some of the things are well known, and the work done by CBGA has been extremely important in this area. For instance, acute shortage of staff. I think in the last several years it has highlighted repeatedly that our public policies and their implementation are massively hampered by massive shortage of staff, especially skilled employees across a range of administrative units, not as much at the national but at subnational levels. How do you deal with those? Just to give you a number, for instance, if you look at some international comparisons, India had 1.5 government sector personnel for every 100 residents, which is much lower compared to, let's say, 5.9 in Brazil or 3.9 in Mexico. These are countries with which we like to compare ourselves, right? We are not comparing right now. I'm not giving you numbers for the Scandinavian countries, right? But even with the comparable instances, right? Likewise, if you look at what kind of arrangements we have in terms of the staff itself, overwhelmingly we are moving towards the contractual staff, the irregular staff, the casual staff. Right? Even in the public sector, for instance, there has been a massive increase. Right? Those of you who do some economics, you would know that there is some distinction called organized and unorganized sector in India. Organized sector and certain kinds of activities, legally we are not supposed to have irregular staff there. Yeah? In terms of the legal provision even today. Right? In perennial activities, you're not supposed to have that. Right? But currently, in the organized sector, the percentage of casual contractual staff is close to 60%. Now, this is a massive violation of whatever laws of the land that we should be respecting. The laws have not been changed as yet, right? But we have found ways and means of doing away with those laws by going around the laws. It's this massive talk about how the current regime is trying to strengthen cooperative federalism by ensuring, through the 14th Finance Commission provision, that states have greater amount of untied resources through this devolution of resources which have been arrived at. Right? Now, it is indeed the case that if you look at only the 14th Finance Commission recommendations, it is indeed the case that now there is greater amount of untied fund. Resources have been transferred to the states, by almost, there's an increase of almost 10 percentage points there, right? But again, this point has been kind of, talked about so much by every spokesperson of the government, without also simultaneously noting that if you look at the aggregate transfer to the states, what has happened to that? The transfers which were happening through other channels. Now, there's this institution which has become history now, If you look at transfers through all these channels, what has happened? I think, again, CBGA had done this exercise and tell us that the CBGA's report tells us that if you look at the projected income for the next year, next financial year, and look at the transfers to the states, it actually has come down from some 6.2% of GDP to about 5.9% or so, right? Now, in that situation, when actually resources have gone down, and then repeatedly telling the states that, look, all these basic services, essential services, are your responsibility, how does that happen? How does that happen? Just think about it. As you think, no, the center is not going to spend more on education, health, etc., because you are flush with funds now. How many lies can you keep peddling? Thank you.